Paul is traveling today, so I'm giving our opening remarks. And just before we get started with today's webinar, I wanted to mention that we had our first species working group forum, and we had a great turnout to discuss the R2R Species Recovery Progress Wheel. And we're continuing to have this species working group forum as a platform for species working groups to come together to discuss topical issues and work on collaborations. So if this is something that you're interested in, we hope to have these perhaps every 2 months. And we'll be announcing additional topics in the near future. So stay tuned for announcements about that forum. And you can also find more information about the forum on our web.
We had some technical difficulty, so had to set up a new Zoom link.
I think that was not for us. Okay, so so feel free to join our website to learn more about that forum. And we're also always looking to initiate additional new species working groups. So if you work on a particular species or you know someone who is, and you're interested in more information on how you can form species working groups, feel free to reach out to us through our Gmail or find more information on our website. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Today we'll be having a talk about the yellow-billed cuckoo. Our speaker today is Calandra Stanley. Calandra Stanley is interested in the behavioral ecology and conservation of migratory birds. Her research aims to understand how migratory birds interact with their environment through their annual cycle using both laboratory and field studies. For her postdoctoral research at Georgetown University, she is tracking yellow-billed cuckoos in order to study their non-breeding ecology and identify spatio-temporal patterns of mortality. She has been a member of the Western Yellow-billed Cuckoo Working Group since 2019. Stanley earned her bachelor's and master's of science in biology from York University, Canada, and her PhD in biological sciences at the University of Maryland under the supervision of Dr. Peter Mara and Dr. Michelle Dudash. So thank you so much, Callie, for your presentation, and I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thanks so much, Quinn, for the introduction, and I'm really excited to share with you some of the work I've been doing with yellow-billed cuckoos and the road to recovery. So today, for the agenda, first I'll give you a very brief introduction about yellow-billed cuckoos and their population status. And then I'll go into where cuckoos stand in the Road to Recovery framework and discuss some of the projects that myself and the Western Yellow-billed Cuckoo Working Group have been working on, both in terms of biological sciences and social sciences. Spoiler alert, we haven't made very much progress in social sciences, but it is something I will discuss. And then finally, I'll briefly touch on some of the upcoming Road to Recovery projects that we have. And so yellow-billed cuckoos are a declining long-distance migratory land bird. They breed in large areas of North America, shown here in this eBird relative abundance map. And they migrate along North and Central America and the Caribbean to South America, where they spend their non-breeding period. And so just a quick note about vocabulary. In this presentation, I am going to use the term non-breeding season to refer solely to the non-migratory phase of the non-breeding period. And when I'm referring to migration, I'll specifically say spring or fall migration. Like many species of migratory birds, data from breeding bird surveys shows an overall decline in cuckoo populations since the 1970s, and this is range-wide data. However, over the last 20 years or so, population trends have somewhat stabilized at the species level. Of course, when you look at the spatial trends across the range, we do see differences in population change over time, with some regions showing continued declines, while others are kind of stable or even increasing. What isn't represented in this breeding bird survey map is most of the western parts of the range, which you can kind of see in these purple dots, purple points peeking out. In the West, declines have been particularly severe historically, and the species has been extirpated from the majority of its historic range, which is shown here in light green. The current remnant populations in the USA are shown in this map in blue. And I should note that this map isn't showing the remnant populations or the remaining populations in Mexico, which you can see with this eBird map are quite extensive. The eastern and western yellow-billed cuckoos are not recognized as different subspecies, but are separated into distinct population segments by the US government. And the western distinct population segment was listed as federally threatened in 2014. Currently, the US Fish and Wildlife Service is in the process of developing a species status assessment for the western DPS. Currently, we only have a working group that is focused on the western distinct population segment, but during this presentation, I will be sharing work done on the species as a whole across the range, as well as projects focused just on the western DPS. The working group, the Western Yellow-billed Cuckoo Working Group, was formed in 2008, and in the early days was really focused on getting the Western DPS listed by the federal government. Once that happened, the group kind of slowed down, but had a recent resurgence around 2019 with the help of Jenna Stanek and Patty Warner really leading the way. The group has about 220 members on our listserv and tends to meet about a minimum of twice a year. The steering committee is composed of 12 members and meets quarterly. And really the goals of the group are to promote projects and conservation efforts across the entire western range of the DPS, and has also been working to expand its geographic scope to the breeding areas in Mexico, but also to other non-breeding regions.
That'd be great.
And really, since this resurgence, there has been a focus on the road to recovery process in the working group. And so if we think about the road to recovery framework and yellow-billed cuckoos, they are really solidly in the phase 1 of the road to recovery framework, in the assessing and learning phase. Overall, the species is definitely further ahead in the biological sciences compared to the social sciences. And for the rest of this talk, I'm really going to share with you how I kind of came up with this assessment, or how we've come up with this assessment, and share with you the state of knowledge of cuckoos in both the biological and social sciences, and share some of the projects that I and other members of the Western Working Group have been working on related to road to recovery. So first, I'll discuss the state of biological science knowledge for the species. And so in 2018, when I started working on cuckoos and the Western Working Group started kind of reemerging or becoming active again, this was kind of how I saw the state of knowledge for cuckoos. We had some really good information on habitat associations and critical breeding habitats, especially for the Western DPS or Western populations, and some informations in the West. There was limited information from Stopover Work in Colombia about habitat associations, but other than that, we didn't know about the rest of the non-breeding seasons. As well as we had some population demographic rates available from both large-scale monitoring programs, but also work done in the West, particularly in the lower Colorado River. And some tracking had been done on Western birds to understand migratory connectivity. But overall, information didn't really exist to build a range-wide population model, which would be needed to identify the factors limiting cuckoo populations. And so one of the first, missing gaps myself and my supervisor, Dr. Peter Mera, thought we could fill was around migratory connectivity. And so we began with a project funded by the Knobloch Family Foundation to begin deploying these newly developed 2-gram satellite transmitters to look at migratory connectivity, and also try to measure survival rates across the species breeding range. So today I will begin by showing some of the information we have recently learned about migratory connectivity of yellow-billed cuckoos and our efforts to identify linked populations. And so really when we started, the non-breeding range of yellow-billed cuckoos was really thought to encompass most of South America east of the Andes. In the west, like I mentioned, yellow-billed cuckoos had been tracked with both light-level geolocators and GPS tags. Here I'm showing data from Southern Sierra Research Station on some birds tagged in the lower Colorado River, and they suggested that western birds were primarily wintering in this kind of southwestern part of the non-breeding range. But this was kind of the extent of the knowledge we had on migratory connectivity for this species. So in this first project, we deployed these brand new satellite transmitters, which you can see right here, on 8 breeding populations across both the eastern and western breeding range, with approximately 5 to 10 tags per breeding population for a total of 54 tags. And we got some really great data on fall migratory routes, and discovered that it wasn't just the western populations utilizing this kind of southwestern part of the non-breeding range, but breeding populations from across the range were predominantly going to this area of South America called the Gran Chaco, which is found in Argentina, northern Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia. Unfortunately, for the most part, the transmitters from this project only lasted about 6 months, so we were really limited to information about fall migration rates and some information about movements in the Gran Chaco. But really, this discovery that the Gran Chaco was the main wintering area was a really big breakthrough. And so we started trying to learn more about this region of South America. But of course, we were quickly told how the Gran Chaco is a highly threatened habitat that is being rapidly deforested. And although there had been some great research looking at the effects of habitat loss on resident avian communities in the Chaco, this information wasn't available for cuckoos, mostly because there has been limited ornithological work conducted during the austral summer months when migrants are using the region. And so this was an area that we really wanted to learn more about. And it really spurred the development of a project to learn more about the non-breeding ecology of cuckoos and understand how this rapid deforestation could be impacting their populations. And so working with collaborators in the region, including BirdLife International and their regional partners, Aves Argentinas and Guiro Paraguay, along with researchers at CONICET in Argentina, we developed this research project to try to identify critical habitats for yellow-billed cuckoos and examine the influence of deforestation in the Gran Chaco. And so in 2022, we were funded by the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Knobloch Family Foundation. And we had our first field season last winter or summer, depending on where you are. The project has 2 main components. The first was to identify critical regions and habitats through a regional bird survey program, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in this talk. And the second was to deploy additional satellite transmitters to fill gaps in our knowledge about the movement of birds on the non-breeding ground in the Gran Chaco, but also to start gaining information about the spring migration. And so by deploying tags in the wintering grounds or non-breeding grounds, we could really fill in that missing gap for transmitters that don't last quite so long. And so last year we deployed our first tags in Paraguay, and this year we deployed some additional ones in Argentina. And so together with the tags deployed in the US, we now have a total of 78 yellow-billed cuckoos tagged, and we have information about fall migration, spring migration, and some really good information about non-breeding habitat use. And so here I've divided all of our tracked birds into 3 different breeding regions based on bird conservation regions. And so we have western birds depicted in red, central breeding birds depicted in yellow, and then eastern breeding birds depicted in blue. And so this color scheme is going to kind of continue for the next little while. With this increase in tracking data across the wintering period, we re-examined what birds were doing on the wintering ground. And even in this map, you can kind of see that it looks like breeding populations might be segregating somewhat within the Gran Chaco, with western birds in red occupying kind of a more southern region of the area. And so to look at this more carefully, I am showing 50% utilization distributions for all the winter locations for the Western breeding region, Central and Eastern breeding regions. And these results do suggest a little bit of segregation, with Central and Eastern birds really occupying the same area, so overlapping quite a lot in this area in the northern regions of the dry Chaco in Paraguay and Bolivia. Well, the majority of Western breeding population locations in the non-breeding grounds are occurring in Argentina and kind of this more southern area relative to the east and west. And so we do seem to be seeing some separation of populations, and we have been able to kind of link breeding and non-breeding populations with this work. We also looked at fall migration routes and have identified 4 major migratory routes to the non-breeding grounds. Although different populations are using population-specific routes to get into South America, once populations arrive in South America, most of the migration routes kind of converge, and birds share a common route along the eastern slope of the Andes to get to the Gran Chaco. We've also identified key staging areas shown here. And although the staging areas in South America are somewhat similar, the staging areas in North America across the different breeding populations are quite different. And so we see that Western birds are occupying this staging area in Mexico and are actually showing a very different migration phenology as well, with birds starting migration and leaving to go to this Mexican staging area significantly earlier than birds in the east, and then arriving in South America significantly later than eastern birds as well. And they kind of skip this northern staging area that is used by both eastern and central birds that is located in northern Colombia and Venezuela. We've done a similar thing during spring migration. However, we have had a little more difficulty identifying patterns, partly due to smaller sample sizes. But now with the starting to deploy tags in the wintering grounds, we're hoping to beef up our sample size. At the moment, we currently only have one single full winter or spring migration for a Western bird. So we are limited in what we can say for Western birds. But overall, we've identified 3 major migration routes. There seems to be more mixing in spring migration, with this central route being used by both eastern and central birds, and this Central American route being used by western and central birds. Again, we identified key staging areas, and overall, the main staging areas are pretty similar between eastern and central breeding populations. And so we get birds stopping in this same staging region that they used in the fall in northern Colombia and Venezuela, and then also utilizing this common area in the Yucatan. Unfortunately, we don't really have sufficient sample sizes to discuss the Western populations, but they're definitely utilizing Central America to some degree. And hopefully with continued deployment of tags in Argentina, we'll be able to answer some of those questions. So overall, we've estimated migratory connectivity by calculating the Mantell correlation every fortnight. So here we have estimates of migratory connectivity from the Mantell correlation over time. Again, with 0 representing very low connectivity and 1 high connectivity. The different colors just represent different seasons. And so we see that overall across the breeding season, or towards the end of the breeding season, we're still seeing very high migratory connectivity, which is shown here in green, which you would expect with birds still being in the breeding region. During the early phases of fall migration, we still see fairly high to moderate migratory connectivity, as birds are still using kind of those population-specific migration routes and having population-specific migration schedules. But as soon as birds start arriving into South America, migratory connectivity really becomes low. And that continues through to the winter, which is shown in blue, as well as during spring migration. And so overall, we're seeing very low migratory connectivity through a lot of fall, winter, and spring migration. But now we can really show how that there's quite a lot of population mixing in the non-breeding season. Before moving on, one additional behavior I wanted to highlight related to migratory connectivity was the high frequency of intraseasonal movements or within season movements. And so here I'm just showing an example of birds that were in the non-breeding grounds. So we have some birds in Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, and Bolivia. These are just 10 individuals, and the data is from late December to late February. And it really shows the large-scale movement birds are engaging in. And this is an extremely common behavior across individuals from all breeding populations, as well as during the breeding and non-breeding season. And so I wanted to point this out because it will likely have important implications when we're thinking about what the habitat requirements are for this species. And so overall, we have done quite a lot of work with deciphering migratory connectivity for this species. And due to that low migratory connectivity between breeding and non-breeding grounds, we have identified linked populations. Next, I wanted to shift gears and start talking about the state of our knowledge on habitat associations and what the habitat requirements are for the species. And to start off with, I'll look at breeding habitats. So in the West, broadly speaking, we have very good information on habitat requirements. Broadly speaking, cuckoos are dependent on large patches of riparian or zero riparian habitat, depending on the region they're in. Out east in the central and eastern breeding populations, they really aren't as reliant on riparian habitats and are really woodland species that occupy interior and edge forest. Far fewer studies have looked at eastern habitat requirements, but similar to the West, birds seem to enjoy a forest with mixed age stands. Overall, the critical breeding habitat requirements do seem to vary across regions. And kind of to better address that variation across regions and understand what these differences in habitat requirements are, a group of researchers that are part of the Western Working Group were awarded a competitive state wildlife grant to conduct a range-wide survey across the Western DPS. And so in 2022, participants from all 12 states that make up the Western distinct population segment conducted surveys for cuckoos with the goal of developing a range-wide species distribution model. And this was really the largest survey ever done for cuckoos in the West. And you can see this, the really large spatial extent of this survey with all these red points marking survey locations. In general, in blue, these stars, which might be a little hard to see, represent places where cuckoos were detected. And as anticipated, the southwestern states really made up the core of the range, and there was much lower detection in kind of the northwestern states and areas where cuckoos aren't typically found. And so currently the species distribution model is being worked on by the researchers in Utah DNR, and this will really provide the first range-wide understanding of habitat requirements for this species. Now on the non-breeding grounds, we have just started investigating habitat requirements for cuckoos in the Gran Chaco. In 2023, we conducted our first cuckoo survey program in Paraguay, and this year we started in Argentina. We will be surveying across 6 different regions in the dry Chaco in Paraguay and Argentina to try and identify key regions and critical habitats in the dry Chaco. Surveys were conducted across 4 different land cover classes, spanning from pure pasture in Paraguay and pure cropland in Argentina, all the way to 100% closed forest. This will allow us to assess how cuckoos respond to human-modified landscapes and assess which land cover classes are critical to their populations. Very preliminary results suggest that cuckoos can really be found in almost all land cover classes as long as there is some remnant forest in the landscape. But abundance definitely varies within regions and land cover classes, and cuckoos do appear to be more abundant in Paraguay. This agrees with what we've seen with our tracking efforts thus far. In total, we now have 41 individuals tracked in the Gran Chaco, and the majority of individuals are in Paraguay, at least at the moment. Moving forward, we are also hoping to use some of this tracking data to examine habitat use for cuckoos in the Gran Chaco. And so what about the migratory periods? Far less is definitely known about habitat use during these periods. Work done by Selva in Colombia has identified key habitat features for cuckoos foraging at stopovers in the stopover region in the north of Colombia. They have also found that cuckoos are really timing their arrival in Colombia to match up with the spring green-up period that happens between April and May, presumably to take advantage of, the burst of insects that comes with the spring green-up. And this work linking cuckoos' migratory movements in Colombia to phenological events really made us wonder if this kind of resource tracking behavior might be driving other cuckoo movements. And so we were really interested in using some of the satellite tracking data to see whether resource tracking might be driving some of the population differences in migration schedules that we saw during fall migration. And so we looked at 3 of the key fall staging areas for cuckoos. So for Western populations, we examined the staging area in Mexico. And then for Central and Eastern populations, we looked at staging areas in Northern Colombia and Venezuela. And then we looked at a communal staging area in Northern Bolivia and Southern Peru. And we examined how well birds' arrival in the region matched up to green up in that region. And so let's look at this first staging area in the west of Mexico. And so in this graph, the line shows the seasonal development of vegetation as measured by the Green Wave Index, which uses EVI as a vegetation index. And the bars represent the proportion of our tagged birds that are in the region over time. And so we really see that birds are moving into Mexico from Western US as the region is increasing in productivities with the monsoon season and leave as productivity before productivity declines. So what does this look like in the other staging areas? Well, we don't really see such a strong pattern in the fall staging areas used by eastern birds in northern Colombia. They're kind of arriving when EVI is already kind of high. However, we definitely see the same pattern emerging further south in Peru and Bolivia. Birds are arriving as EVI is peaking, and as well in the Gran Chaco, this is occurring. And so we're really interested in exploring this phenological synchronization a little more during both spring migration, but as well as whether it could explain some of the within season movements we are seeing in the non-breeding grounds in the Gran Chaco. So overall, we are gathering really good information about habitat requirements and starting to fill in some of our missing gaps on the breeding and non-breeding seasons. And so next, what we need to do is really look at where we stand with regards to demographic rates, which is kind of key information needed to build a population model and identify factors driving population regulation in cuckoos. And then in this department, we definitely have made less movement, but it's something we have been thinking about as we build up the other biological knowledge. And so there is some long-term population trend data for cuckoos from large-scale monitoring programs. In the East, breeding bird survey data covers cuckoos very well, but this is not the case out west. There is eBird data available across the range. And there's quite a lot of a smaller scale survey data in the Western DPS. And so this could be a really good source of information to look at population change over time in the West. And currently, Kristen Dillon at the Fish and Wildlife Service has been working to generate kind of a centralized database to house this information so that we could better see how this data could be used over time. To estimate productivity, we do have some breeding demographic work at specific sites, both in the East and the West, particularly in the West and the lower Colorado River, with work done by the Southern Sierra Research Station. But in general, the breeding data is fairly limited temporally and spatially, but is available. In terms of survival data, myself and Clark Rushing at UGA are currently working on a method to estimate annual survival from these small satellite transmitters that we started using. And this would give us population-specific estimates of survival across the breeding range or at different populations. And then finally, we do have a pretty good idea of major threats to cuckoos across the annual cycle. Deforestation is kind of, the broad threat across the annual cycle. But in the West, altered hydrology, which has led to habitat loss and degradation, is also a concern. And so putting all these pieces together into a population model is kind of the last step we would need to move out of phase 1 of the Road to Recovery framework. And of course, that is easier said than done, but we do almost have all the components needed. So we have established linked populations, we have some population data, we're getting we're working on generating population-specific survival rates. So we're nearing the stage where we could really put this all together. And so this is kind of where we stand in terms of biological knowledge. And what about social science? Well, as I mentioned earlier, this is probably the area where we struggle the most. And we have definitely made some great inroads identifying partners across the annual cycle, especially using the migratory connectivity data. The Western Working Group has really worked hard to develop a website and begin translating the material on that website so it can be relevant to partners across the annual cycle. And it is definitely something that the working group is thinking about, and we have applied to grants to try and kind of kickstart this work. But it's definitely the area where we could use a lot of help with. And as we move forward, I think it will take a lot of intentional thought as we are developing new projects to make sure we are including all relevant partners from the beginning of the project to make sure that they really are engaging in co-production. And so overall, that is where I see the yellow-billed cuckoo standing. And this presentation is by far not meant to be all inclusive of the efforts that are underway, just highlighting some of the work that is being done. And so what are kind of our next steps for the working group or the species? I already mentioned, a major goal is to develop the social science knowledge that is needed, both on the breeding and non-breeding ground. And then the ultimate goal on the biology side would be the development of a range-wide population model. But how will we accomplish these next two goals? And how do we figure out how to move forward? Well, we are hoping to use two tools to help in this job. So the first one is the Road to Recovery wheel, which we are hoping will help us to kind of evaluate where we stand in a more systematic way and try to understand how best to proceed. So we are in the process of we just started the process of filling that out. Not only will it help us take stock of where we are, but can also help us kind of track our progress, use as a tool to track our progress. And so we're really excited to work with the R2R team on that. And then secondly, we are undertaking a rapid structured decision-making process for the Western designated population segment to try and understand where we could focus our research efforts on kind of more the biological side of things. And these efforts are really being spearheaded by Patty Warner. Both the efforts on the recovery wheel and structured decision-making and a lot of other projects are going to be discussed next October in Colorado at the AOS meeting, where yellow-billed cuckoos have a symposium. So I really encourage everyone who's going to attend to come and get an update on the projects that I've discussed here, including the two progress tools I mentioned, as well as other projects that I didn't get a chance to talk about. And so as I kind of wrap up this discussion, I just wanted to thank all of our partners on both the breeding, all of my partners on both the breeding and non-breeding grounds, on projects on those areas, and of course the members of the Western Working Group and all of our wonderful funding sources. And so now I would be happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for a really exciting presentation. It's awesome to see the progress that you've made on filling some of these key knowledge gaps. And as you mentioned, we are now opening the floor to questions. You can ask your questions in the chat, or you can turn on your video, your audio, and ask your question live. Yes, Mary's got a question.
Hi, Callie. Great job and great
Thanks,
work.
Mary.
I'm really happy to see the work you all are doing in South America. I just wanted to make a short note that from MODIS, we do have evidence that Western yellow-billed cuckoos must go over the Gulf occasionally, because we had that one bird, Stroopwafel, that ended up at, is it Mad Hat Island near Houston at the refuge before 2 weeks later that it showed up at the Curran.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And yeah, I'm hoping we deployed some tags in Argentina this winter, so I'm hoping some of those birds are Western and that the tags will last long enough. But in the meantime, you know, putting together all the different tracking data and different sources of information to better understand, especially spring migration, where we don't have so much data on the West, is really fantastic.
Yeah, agreed.
Great, go ahead with your question. You've got your hand raised also, team.
Hi, Callie. Good job. Great presentation. I'm really excited to see what you guys are doing down there. I was wondering if you saw any differences in rates of deforestation or threats in Argentina, where a lot of the Western DPS breeding birds are wintering.
Yeah, so there are definitely different rates. So you know, I had a deforestation image, and of course I took it out. I should have left it at the end. But rates of deforestation aren't necessarily higher in Argentina, I don't think, but it's already happened in Argentina. So a lot of the Gran Chaco in Argentina, it has already been developed and it continues to be developed. Whereas in Paraguay, that process is, you know, occurring at the moment as we speak. So if you look at the map, there is definitely way more forest left in Paraguay and in Bolivia compared to Argentina. And so that is really, you know, one of the things we're interested in looking at, whether or not that could be driving not necessarily continued declines in Western populations, but why Western populations aren't recovering as well as kind of people have expected them to, as riparian habitats have been restored. And so this could be maybe a factor that is influencing that.
That's what I was wondering. Thank you for having birds down there that can confirm that for us potentially. Appreciate that.
All right, I'll give people some more time to think about their question. I was wondering if you could just speak to kind of how the working group, how you identify partners and work together, and maybe some of the more logistical sides of leveraging your working group to recover species.
So yeah, I guess when we first learned about the Gran Chaco, we really started investigating who was working down there. And in the Gran Chaco region, BirdLife International Partners are really kind of the main NGOs working in the region. But we also reached out to collaborators to find out people working just, you know, through word of mouth as well. Giving presentations on this work really helped us get the word out and identify people who could link us up. But yeah, once we started looking, there aren't, you know, that many people working in the Gran Chaco. You know, it has these, you know, it's the second largest, you know, biome in South America. It's, you know, highly threatened. And yet, you know, there isn't really as much push to research the ground chaco as much as, like, say, the Amazon. And so, yeah, I mean, trying to get groups together to work on that has been really key. And I didn't mention them, but I probably should have. There's also a Gran Chaco working group that has been meeting fairly regularly for a couple of years now, and really taking a broader approach, not just focused on birds, but it is a lot of bird people, to think about how we can generate conservation in the region and research to support that conservation.
Great, thanks. You've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Hey, Callie. Yeah, great presentation. It's always so much fun to see everything put together that we've been hearing about. I guess my question is, so we've been seeing, looking at the long-term trend data, we've been seeing this somewhat annoying increase in cuckoos over recent years, so that the decline keeps getting, the overall decline keeps showing up as less and less. And that seems to be consistent, that there still seem to be going up in recent years. So I'm just wondering, from the perspective of resource tracking that you looked at spatially, whether there's any work to look at year-to-year changes and whether their populations might, over the long term, be more cyclic or follow something kind of like a spruce budworm. I know that's been suggested, but is there anything going on that could explain this overall increase we're starting to see, at least in the East?
I mean, we haven't really started, we've just started exploring this kind of resource tracking, angle. And I'm not sure. I mean, I think one of the things we really need, and this is talked about a lot in the Western Working Group, is really pairing up with, entomologists, because they understand, how insect populations work a lot more. But yeah, in theory, we could just look at, El Nino data, ENSO data, and really see if some of the population trends are linked to these kind of more cyclical patterns that should reflect insects as well. And so I think that's definitely, when we get to the stage where we're, in the East using breeding bird survey data to look at what might be driving population trends, I think including some of those, broad scale cyclical environmental data will be really key to, maybe getting at those types of questions. But if people have ideas about how to look at this, I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah, and it is, like you said, it's very well established that cuckoos in the East, at least, really move into areas when cicadas outbreaks or gypsy moth outbreaks come in. But how to really quantify that, I think eBird is probably a tool that could be really good at quantifying that. But I don't know of anyone who's actually looking at that.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Great. And John, go ahead. You've got your hand up.
Hi, Callie. And I had a comment on the same line that Ken just asked. Is your threats mentioned the deforestation and habitat significantly, but cuckoo prey base in the West is definitely something that the group needs to explore deeper. Tying in with entomologists across the range would be so important. It seems to be a real missing link that we're not looking at, especially with the increase in pesticide use over the last 20 years in the West.
Yeah, and that's definitely a concern that's echoed on the non-breeding ground, especially in Argentina, where, so in Paraguay, the deforestation is really driven by cattle ranches, whereas in Argentina, it's really developed in cropland, and that's why we're working in cropland in Argentina, and so soy and corn. And so obviously much higher pesticide uses, which could be influencing prey sources. So I do think this is very much an area that the working group in general, and just in general, we could be looking at more carefully. It's just so difficult to monitor insect populations is, the takeaway I keep getting. But I do think that, with the use of ARUs increasing, that's maybe an interesting way where we could look at insect populations, because insects are picked up on ARUs. And there has been a lot of discussion in the Western Yellow-billed Cuckoo group about that. But But yeah, I think this is definitely something we should be kind of thinking about.
Great. And we have a question from the chat asking, in your opinion, how best can partners in the US and Mexico support conservation efforts on migratory and wintering grounds?
I mean, I really do think that making sure as you're, if you're working at a species level, you're engaging with partners on those areas. I mean, we know that these periods of time are intricately linked. And so reaching out and finding out what the needs of those partners are on the non-breeding grounds or wherever you're talking about is really key, because the reality is that, on the non-breeding grounds, migrants, this random migratory bird that comes down there might not be the, key primary concern. And so figuring out ways of integrating your research so it benefits both, resident species that are there or other migratory species in the region, I think is really key to making sure that the partnerships can last and are beneficial for both sides of the equation. I think there is some really, strong possibility of bringing, US dollars or North American dollars down to the non-breeding grounds, but these projects have to be well thought out so that all the partners involved are really benefiting from the work.
Great, thanks for that perspective. We have another question from the chat asking if you're considering any communication materials that demonstrate the hemispheric connections. Selfishly, they would love to have some to show the US State Fish and Wildlife agencies how they connect to work on the non-breeding grounds.
Yeah, so I'm working on a manuscript on migratory connectivity right now that will hopefully be finished as soon as possible. But in terms of like developing, communication material separate from that, not necessarily, but I do think that is something that would be great to have, especially for working groups to have. It's just one of those tricky balances between, whether you have money to, work on that kind of stuff. But yeah, definitely, I'm hoping to have a publication out that would, show those links between the breeding and non-breeding grounds and migration.
Thanks. We have another question asking, in order to focus conservation efforts for migratory land birds like the yellow-billed cuckoo, they were wondering, would you suggest focus on landscapes according to food resources? Or in your research, you found specific sites like IBAs for this species, specifically on Gran Chaco and North or South America? In other words, is it possible to find specific sites that can be irreplaceable for this species?
So I think that's definitely possible, but it will take quite a lot of time to find specific sites. One of the risks, especially like in Argentina and Paraguay, rates of deforestation are really high. And so at a certain point, like the best thing we can do for birds in those regions is just to conserve some forests. But obviously we want to like choose the best places possible. But I do think some of the survey work and especially the tracking data could really be used to show, areas that are important. So to help with the identification of important bird areas, especially if birds are using particular, kind of highways to move around. We haven't like necessarily seen evidence of that, but we haven't really had a chance to analyze that data close enough to do that. But I do think that's like a real power of this tracking data is that you can really get, regional landscape level information about moving, which would be a lot harder to get with bird surveys because, I mean, you're just limited in how many points you can go out and count. And so, yeah, I'm excited to see how we can use this tracking data to better refine areas that could be important for cuckoos and other species in the Gran Chaco region. Same with, in some of the staging areas. I mean, it really is amazing. I don't know that I really explained this so much, but I specifically use the term staging area instead of stopover because birds are spending like considerable amounts of time in these regions. And so we've had like, eastern breeding birds leave the Gran Chaco to move up to staging areas in the north, in February, and then stay there for a couple of months before actually, leaving South America. And so this identification of these key areas and staging areas that are used by like the entire population, like the global populations of cuckoos, really, identifies that these are key areas where, important bird areas could be identified and would be really important for the species as a whole.
That looks like all the questions, although we do have a comment saying that some co-authors and this person have been working on modeling the effects of annual and spatially explicit climate variables on breeding bird survey data over the long term, about 50 years. So they're happy to share code and consult on ideas for the application to yellow-billed cuckoos.
Yeah, I mean, that would be amazing.
And we have another question asking if there's evidence of birds molting while in these staging areas.
Yeah, so that's something I really didn't discuss, and it was really just an oversight. Yeah, I mean, one of the big things that has come out with this project in the Gran Chaco is that we've really identified the Gran Chaco as the major molting area for birds. From what I understand from speaking with Nick Bailey in Colombia from Selva, they aren't really finding birds molting there. And so it appears to us that all the molts, the Gran Chaco is the major molting region for cuckoos. Further evidence of its importance to the species.
All right, and we have a question asking if there's other needs for more yellow-billed cuckoo breeding data. They have 8 years of land bird surveys along a section of the Mississippi River.
I mean, yeah, definitely. We've definitely been looking for any kind of breeding data that we can get. So yeah, I'd love to reach out.
All right, we're closing in on the hour. Does anyone have any last minute burning questions, or feel free to reach out to Road to Recovery or Callie after the close of this webinar if you are interested in have more questions or have additional data or code or collaboration or resources you'd love to share with the Yellow-billed Cuckoo Working Group. And thanks again, Callie, for a really interesting talk. Learned a lot about the Yellow-billed Cuckoo, and hopefully everyone else did as well.
Thanks, everyone.
And I'll try to download